For 20 years, we learned to navigate a world of strict institutional guardrails. We move from one syllabus to the next, relying on professors to curate our reading and degree plans to define our progress. When those structures vanish at graduation, the momentum often stops. Without an external schedule, it is easy to spend the next several decades passively accumulating experiences without ever examining what they actually mean. This division is based on an observation by the historian Edward Gibbon. He argued that every person who rises above the common level receives two educations, the first from their teachers and the second from themselves. We spend our formative years perfecting the first education, but we rarely develop the tools to manage the second once we are on our own. On the self-taught path, you are the architect of your own curriculum. That means every hour of study is a test of your own discipline and your ability to impose order on a chaotic sea of information. Without a method for processing what we read, knowledge remains fleeting. We might consume a dozen books a year, but if we don't engage with the ideas, they pass through our minds without leaving a permanent mark. To move past this, the self-taught mind has to build a personal architecture, a deliberate way to intercept and digest those experiences. Gibbon's solution was the maintenance of an exact daily journal. He treated the journal as a laboratory. It was a space dedicated to tracking the movement of his mind as he encountered new ideas, preserving the labor of learning rather than just the facts he found. This flowchart shows how Gibbon transformed reading into an active process. He would break down a text into distinct notes, questioning the author's intent, summarizing the core logic, and then passing judgment on whether the argument held up. In this system, reading is no longer an end in itself. It is a tool used to fuel the actual work of thinking. We can see this same framework in the habits of a modern student like Gino. He uses journaling to physically slow down the process of understanding. Gino practices what he calls a dialogue with the page. After reading a difficult text, he writes down this central argument, explaining how that ancient perspective might reveal a flaw in modern thinking. Next, he uses demanding historical and spiritual texts to measure his character against the ideals he reads. This leads to uncomfortable questions. Where am I resisting the truth? Does my discipline match the ambition recorded in these pages? This style of journaling forces the learner to confront their own progress. Writing becomes a way to see precisely how an idea is beginning to change your habits. This discipline is difficult to maintain. Sometimes fatigue makes writing feel like a heavy burden, and the blank page feels like a judgment on how little you've accomplished. There is also the psychological hurdle of honesty. It's unsettling to document the gap between what you believe and how you spent your day. Gibbon managed this by viewing the journal as a stewardship of time. Consistency was always more important than the quality of any single entry. The goal was to keep the record exact. Facing that blank page, even with shallow thoughts, builds intellectual endurance. The friction itself is what makes the education take hold. The point of Gibbon's method isn't to become more knowledgeable for the sake of appearances. It is to use that knowledge to refine your judgment. Over a decade, a reading log evolves. It becomes an archive that preserves not just what you studied, but how you changed as a result of that study. As the entries accumulate, patterns emerge that were invisible in the moment. You can trace exactly how your convictions strengthened and which weaknesses you've slowly learned to overcome. Wisdom is rarely the result of a single epiphany. It is built through the repetition of small, disciplined acts of reflection. This practice provides two things. It gives you an honest look at your current inner life, and it creates a record you can use to plan your future growth. Lifelong learning is an ongoing conversation. You are constantly testing your past experiences against new information and your current faith. To succeed in this second education, you have to move beyond just reading books. You must become the learner who hunts for knowledge, and the witness who records the path that knowledge takes to become part of your character.
What if I told you that the smartest, most deeply educated person you know probably didn't get that way sitting in a tiered lecture hall?
Right.
Like they didn't get that way by following some beautifully printed syllabus or chasing a letter grade.
Yeah. Definitely not.
They got that way alone, you know, sitting at a desk, facing a completely blank notebook, and engaging in this process that is honestly kind of terrifying if you aren't used to it.
Oh, yeah. Terrifying is the right word.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are exploring the hidden, really granular mechanics of self-education. Our mission today is to figure out exactly how you can rewire your brain and basically fundamentally alter your character without a professor or a deadline or an institution telling you what to do.
And it is a massive shift in mindset. I mean, we're pulling today from this really fascinating essay published back in 2010.
Right.
It's by Gilbert Villalpando, and it's this deep, very personal reflection on the gritty reality of teaching yourself.
Yeah, the grit is what stands out to me.
Exactly. He details the habits of this modern learner, a guy named Gino, who basically decided to model his entire intellectual life after the legendary 18th century historian Edward Gibbon.
Which is quite the role model, honestly.
It is. But what makes this source material so compelling to me is that it completely strips away that sort of romanticized Hollywood version of the lone genius.
Right, the guy just sitting by candlelight looking brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. It gets into the actual psychological friction, you know, the daily failures, the emotional hurdles of trying to build your own intellect completely from scratch.
Okay, well, let's unpack this, because before we can even get into Gino's specific habits, like what he's actually doing with his pen and paper on a Tuesday night,
Right.
we kind of have to understand the philosophy that drives him in the first place, and that brings us to Edward Gibbon. There is this quote from Gibbon in the essay that just sets the stakes immediately for me. He says, "Every man who rises above the common level has received two educations. The first from his teachers, the second, more personal and important, from himself."
That distinction right there between the first and second education, that is the absolute bedrock of everything we are talking about today.
Yeah.
The first education is the formal schooling. It's the institution. And Gibbon is basically arguing that whatever you get from that system is really just the baseline.
Just to make you functional.
Exactly. It makes you functional in society.
Mm-hmm.
You learn to read, you learn basic math, but anything that elevates a person, like any true wisdom or profound mastery, that has to come from that second education.
Right.
Which you are entirely responsible for.
I think about formal university education kind of like taking a guided tour bus through a foreign city.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like you pay your tuition, which is your ticket, right?
Bro.
And you get on the bus, and the route is entirely predetermined by the university. The driver decides when you stop, the tour guide tells you the exact narrative of what you're looking at, and your only real job is to just sort of sit back, look out the window, and occasionally repeat back what the guide said on a multiple choice test.
Right. It's safe.
It is safe, it's structured, and it is largely passive.
Passive is the key word there, I think. Traditional university learning often just defaults to passive reception because the structure demands it.
Yeah.
Like, the institution provides the friction. They provide the deadlines, the grades. You are essentially just a vessel waiting to be filled with information. But this second education,
The self-taught path.
right, this path that Gino is on, it removes all of that external scaffolding.
So it's like being shoved out of the tour bus and just dropped into the middle of a vast wilderness.
Exactly.
There is no bus. There's no guide telling you the history of the mountains. You have to build your own compass. You have to decide which peak is actually worth climbing and figure out how to survive the elements of your own distraction, really.
And the scary part is, if you sit down and do nothing, nobody is going to come along and give you a failing grade.
Right. You just stagnate.
You just stagnate. And what's fascinating here is the psychological mechanism required to survive in that wilderness. Because a self-educated person cannot depend on an external authority to validate their learning.
They have to build it internally.
Right. They have to build an internal infrastructure.
Yeah.
Gibbon didn't just read books to accumulate facts. He kept these incredibly detailed, relentless journals.
Yeah, and the source text makes a point that these weren't diaries about the weather or what he had for dinner.
No, not at all.
They call it a laboratory of thought.
A laboratory thought, yeah.
Yes, I want to linger on that phrase for a second because a laboratory of thought implies experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
It implies taking raw materials, kind of mixing them together, applying heat, and seeing what explodes or what crystallizes.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The essay says his journals preserve the movement of a mind in formation, which tells me this isn't just about memory.
Right.
It's about active, really grueling labor.
It's grueling because the self-taught student kind of has to split their consciousness, don't they? Like, according to the essay, to do this correctly, you have to become two things simultaneously. You have to be the learner and the witness.
Yes, the learner and the witness.
How does that actually work in the brain?
So when you are the learner, you are actively pursuing the knowledge, right? You're decoding the text, you're wrestling with the concepts, doing all the raw intake of information.
Okay.
But if you stop there, you are just accumulating trivia.
Which is what a lot of people do, honestly.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
But to actually educate yourself, a part of your mind has to step back and act as the witness. The witness carefully observes and records how that new knowledge is actively changing the learner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you are watching your own mind respond to the arguments or the poetry or the history that you're consuming.
So in a traditional school, the professor is the witness.
Right. They grade your paper to tell you if you've changed or learned anything.
Yeah.
But in the wilderness of self-education, you have to witness yourself.
That requires a level of self-awareness that is, frankly, intimidating to me. Like, I'm trying to picture what this looks like for the listener who wants to try applying this tonight.
Yeah. Let's get into the mechanics.
Yeah, if self-education demands building your own structure and playing the role of your own witness, what are the actual mechanics of that? Gibbon had a rule for this. He wrote, "Let us read with method and propose to ourselves an end to which our studies may point. The use of reading is to aid us in thinking."
The reading is just the raw material. The thinking is the actual product.
Right.
And this is where we look at Gino, the modern learner in Vilpamo's essay, who is essentially trying to drag Gibbon's rigorous 18th century methods into our highly distracted modern world.
Which is a challenge.
A huge challenge.
Yeah.
So Gino doesn't just read a chapter, feel a vague sense of accomplishment, and then put the book back on the shelf. He executes a very specific, heavily layered journaling pattern.
See, here's where it gets really interesting for me, because this isn't just taking notes in the margins with a highlighter. Gino has a deliberate 3-step psychological gauntlet that he puts himself through every time he reads something substantial.
Let's walk through it.
Yeah. So step 1 is fairly standard. He records a passage, an event, or an observation from the text. So he captures the raw data.
Right. But step 2 is where the friction begins. He stops and explains entirely in his own words why that specific passage matters.
What's the central argument? What's the core truth?
Exactly.
Which is so much harder than it sounds because, I mean, we have all highlighted a brilliant paragraph in a book and we feel smart just for highlighting.
Oh, absolutely. You feel like a genius.
Yeah. We think the author's brilliance is somehow magically transferred to us through the yellow marker. But if you actually force yourself to close the book and write out the author's argument in your own words,
you suddenly realize you didn't understand it nearly as well as you thought you did.
you stumble hard.
You stumble because paraphrasing breaks the illusion of competence. It forces cognitive synthesis.
Yeah.
You are having to translate their vocabulary into your own mental framework. And if you can't explain it simply, the witness part of your brain steps in and says, hey, you didn't learn this yet.
Wow, yeah. But step 3 is the truly transformative part of Gino's method, I think. After he explains the passage, he turns the insight inward.
Right.
He aggressively tests the idea against his own lived experience.
Yes.
He asks how this 18th century historian or this ancient philosopher applies to his own character, his faith, or his daily habits.
He takes the abstract idea and forces it into collision with his own reality.
Collision, that's a good word for it.
Precisely. It is that third step that separates a common reading journal from a true laboratory of thought. He is intentionally, forcefully slowing down the process of understanding.
I am so glad you mentioned slowing down.
Yeah.
Because it runs entirely counter to everything we are taught about consuming information today.
Oh, 100%.
We live in a culture that gamifies reading. You know, people brag on social media about reading 50 or 100 books a year.
The Goodreads challenge.
Exactly. They optimize their reading speed. They listen to audiobooks on double speed, just rushing from one bestseller to the next just to add it to a digital shelf. But Gino is doing the exact opposite. He is hitting the brakes so hard, he's practically leaving skid marks on the page.
Right, because if your goal is just to accumulate facts, to win at bar trivia, or to feel like you're being productive, then binge reading works.
Sure.
But you are not examining your experience. Gino uses specific, targeted questions to interrogate the text. But more importantly, he uses those questions to interrogate himself.
What kind of questions?
So he'll read Gibbon's monumental history of Rome and write down a question in his journal like, what specific daily discipline made this writer capable of such sustained, decades-long study?
Okay, so he's looking for the engine behind the achievement, not just the achievement itself.
Exactly. Or he'll read a piece of Stoic philosophy or a piece of scripture and ask a deeply uncomfortable question, like, where does my actual life resist the truth I have just read?
Oof, that's tough.
Or he will end a day by simply sitting with the notebook and asking, what did today teach me?
Okay, I get the mechanics. I see the 3 steps. But realistically, I have to push back on this.
Okay, go ahead.
Because if I am the listener and I have a demanding job, a long commute, maybe kids running around,
Sure.
and I finally sit down at 9 p.m. to read a book I've been looking forward to all week, if I have to stop, interrogate every single paragraph, formulate a 3-part thesis, and then write a deep, soul-searching reflection on how my life is hypocritically resisting its truth,
Yeah.
doesn't that just completely murder the joy of reading? I mean, it sounds like it would destroy the momentum of a great book. It sounds exhausting.
Well, it sounds exhausting because you are still defining the joy of reading through the lens of entertainment or volume. The essay makes a critical distinction that addresses this exact feeling of resistance you're talking about. Gino is constantly asking himself a very confronting question in his journal to check his own motives.
Okay.
He asks, am I reading to be transformed or only to appear knowledgeable?
Wow. Only to appear knowledgeable. That is a dagger of a question.
It really cuts right to the ego. If your subconscious goal is to appear knowledgeable, like if you want to be able to drop a smart quote at a dinner party or sound authoritative in a Slack channel,
Right.
or just feel a sense of intellectual superiority, then yes, this intense 3-step journaling process is going to feel like a massive, joyless roadblock.
Because it ruins the momentum of hoarding trivia.
Exactly.
And it forces you to realize you aren't actually as smart as the books you own.
Right. But if your genuine goal is transformation, if you actually want your character to evolve, then the joy doesn't come from closing the book and adding it to a completed list.
Where does it come from then?
The deep satisfaction comes directly from the friction of changing your own mind. By slowing down and using the journal as a diagnostic tool, Gino actively avoids the trap of intellectual pride. He isn't pretending to have mastered the subject just because his eyes scan the words. He remains incredibly humble before it.
Yeah. The essay uses this brilliant metaphor to describe what is happening in those moments of humility. It quotes Gibbon saying that books are faithful mirrors that reflect the minds of sages and heroes.
Yes.
And then Villalpando notes that the journal is the mirror where the learner observes their own mind responding to those voices. It frames the entire act of reading not as a lecture you are sitting through, but as a dialogue.
A conversation.
Right. It's a living conversation between the page and your own conscience.
And that layered quality where the notebook is simultaneously a record of historical facts, a spiritual reflection, and a brutally honest moral inventory, that is what gives his journaling its forward motion.
Yeah.
He's constantly moving from historical notes to recognizing his personal weaknesses to forging practical resolutions for the next day.
I want to transition into what happens when that forward motion hits a wall.
Okay, yeah.
Because this level of intense daily self-interrogation sounds incredibly noble when we talk about it conceptually on a podcast.
Right.
It sounds like the path of a philosopher king.
It does sound great in theory.
But let's look at the reality of doing this on a random Thursday in November. What happens when the initial enthusiasm of being a self-taught scholar completely wears off?
When it just becomes work.
Yeah. When Gino is just sitting there staring at a blank page, the house is quiet, and he is just deeply, deeply tired.
Well, the source material is very grounded about this. It does not shy away from the emotional toll this takes.
Good.
The emotional challenges are not a side effect of the self-education process. They are the crucible where the actual education happens.
Okay.
The most pervasive hurdle Gino faces isn't a lack of intelligence, it's simple consistency. Like, there are days when the connections flow and the thoughts are clear, but there are far more days where fatigue, digital distraction, or just a deep creeping discouragement make picking up the pen feel like lifting a boulder.
I think everyone listening can relate to this specific feeling.
Oh, for sure.
Imagine you decide you are going to take your intellectual life seriously. You go to the bookstore and you buy one of those really expensive, beautiful, thick leather notebooks.
Oh, yeah, the moleskines or whatever.
Yeah, the pages are pristine, the binding is tight.
The kind of notebook where You feel like every word you write in it needs to be absolutely profound.
Yes, you feel like you need a calligraphy pen just to touch the thing. So you buy it, you have this grand vision of your new intellectual life, and you write in it perfectly for exactly 3 days.
Naturally.
Your handwriting is immaculate, your insights feel sharp, and then, a crisis happens at work, you get sick, life happens, you miss a day.
Then you miss a week.
And suddenly, looking at that beautiful leather notebook sitting on your desk fills you with this low-grade anxiety and guilt.
Becomes a source of stress?
It stops being a tool for growth and starts feeling like this harsh mirror in a fitting room with terrible fluorescent lighting. It just ruthlessly exposes your lack of discipline.
Yeah, the text talks about the fear of the blank page.
Yeah.
It's this hesitation Gino feels, driven by the dread that once he actually forces himself to write his thoughts down, they're going to look incredibly shallow compared to what he was just reading.
That fear of looking shallow is intimately tied to the pain of exposure, isn't it?
Exactly. When Gino forces himself to sit at the desk and write honestly, bypassing his own ego, the journal inevitably reveals the uncomfortable, often painful distance between what he claims to believe and how he actually behaves.
That is the fitting room mirror right there.
Right. He is forced to stare at his own contradictions.
He has to look at the hypocrisy. Like, he reads about stoic calm all week, but his journal reveals he lost his temper in traffic 3 times that same week.
And the essay outlines some very specific, dangerous traps that happen in the journaling process when you are faced with that hypocrisy, because the brain wants to protect itself from that discomfort.
Right. Cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. So one trap is that the reflection devolves into a spiral of mere self-criticism. Instead of analyzing a failure to figure out how to grow, Gino might just sit there overthinking, beating himself up, and wallowing in guilt.
Which is really just another form of self-absorption, isn't it?
It is.
It's easier to just call yourself a failure than it is to actually change your behavior.
Way easier. Another trap is filling pages with brilliant observations about the world that never once translate into personal action.
Just philosophizing into the void.
Right. But the most insidious trap the essay mentions, the one that truly derails self-education, is writing about a discipline while actively avoiding practicing it.
Oh man, creating a false persona on the page.
Yep.
Writing this eloquent, sweeping paragraph about the supreme virtue of waking up at dawn to study, while knowing full well you have been hitting snooze and sleeping in every single day that month.
Exactly. You are essentially performing for a non-existent audience. You are trying to trick the witness.
You are using the journal to hide from the very truths it was designed to reveal in the first place. You build this avatar of yourself out of ink, and you fall in love with the avatar instead of doing the hard work of changing the real person.
Right.
So this raises a really important question for me. If the journal is constantly threatening to expose your shallowness, your hypocrisy, and your lack of discipline, and if it's so easy to fall into these traps of self-pity or self-deception, how do you possibly push through that emotional friction? Like, why not just close the beautiful leather notebook, put it in a drawer, and turn on the television like everybody else?
Well, the answer lies in how Edward Gibbon himself framed the entire endeavor. The essay points to a very specific, pivotal journal entry from Gibbon, dated August 24th, 1761.
Okay.
Gibbon wrote that he proposed to keep an exact journal of his actions and studies, both to assist my memory and to accustom me to set a due value on my time.
Set a due value on my time. That completely changes the framing.
It removes the melodrama.
Yeah.
For Gibbon, and therefore for Gino trying to emulate him, the journal is not meant to be a purely emotional outlet. It is not a place to just bleed your feelings onto the page or judge your ultimate worth as a human being.
Right.
It is a deliberate, almost clinical practice of stewardship over one's life. When you view the journal through the lens of stewardship, the blank page becomes a laboratory where failure is not final. And it's not fatal.
So when Gino writes down a failure, say, he realizes he wasted 4 hours scrolling online instead of reading.
Yeah, common modern problem.
Very common. It isn't a permanent stain on his character, it's just data.
Exactly. The confusion and the guilt are contained within the borders of the page. And the essay explicitly notes that through this clinical, honest process, discouragement is transformed into a fresh resolve to begin again.
Because if you refuse to write it down, if you avoid the notebook entirely, that failure or that hypocrisy just sort of floats around in your subconscious as this vague, toxic cloud of anxiety.
Yes, you just feel generally bad about yourself, but you aren't sure why.
But the moment you articulate it on the page, it ceases to be a cloud and becomes a concrete problem to be solved.
It requires patience with your own weakness. You face the truth of what you did, you have the humility to admit it in ink, and you simply start over the next morning.
That cyclical process of failing, recording the failure accurately, reflecting on why it happened, and beginning again. That is how the notebook transforms from being a simple catalog of books you've read into a really precise instrument of deep character formation.
Which brings us to the ultimate purpose of all this agonizing effort.
Right.
Because pushing through the emotional hurdles, staring down the dread of the blank page, admitting to yourself that you read a dense article just to sound smart in a meeting.
Yeah, that's hard to do.
It's incredibly difficult work, but it serves the long game. The self-taught mind isn't ultimately concerned with retaining encyclopedic facts about the Roman Empire or memorizing philosophy.
Okay.
It is deeply concerned with who the learner is actually becoming as a human being. It is about long-term moral growth.
The essay makes a very strong argument that this specific style of journaling actively shapes Gino's character because it repeatedly, day after day, year after year, places him squarely before the unvarnished truth of his inner life.
It forcibly strips away his delusions about himself.
Yeah. It teaches him to rely on humility rather than denial. And crucially, it trains him in gratitude.
The gratitude aspect is so essential here because the human brain is wired with a negativity bias.
Right. So how does intensely interrogating your own flaws train you to be grateful? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, it forces Gino to notice and document the small, incremental pieces of evidence of his own growth that would otherwise be completely forgotten.
Because without a written record, we really only remember the extremes.
Exactly.
We remember our massive, humiliating failures, or we remember grand, sudden successes. We completely lose the middle ground.
But the journal captures the slow, quiet, glacial changes in a person's character. Gino can look back at an entry from 3 years ago and see a specific temptation or a source of anger that used to derail his entire week.
Yeah.
And realize that today, it barely registers as an annoyance. Or he could look at a complex philosophical idea that used to completely baffle him and see that now it forms the foundation of his worldview.
So the journal provides empirical evidence that the effort is actually working.
Yes.
So how does this all translate to the actual daily grind of the person listening to this right now? Because the essay makes it very clear that this entire endeavor isn't just navel-gazing.
Yeah.
It isn't just sitting in a room getting morally pure by yourself. There has to be actionable integration.
Right. The value of this intense journaling only becomes fully visible when these private, written reflections begin to dictate his choices out in the real world, far beyond the page.
The journal has to bleed into reality.
Exactly. The source text gives excellent, concrete examples of what this integration looks like. Let's look at the mechanics of reading again.
Okay.
Say Gino's journal reveals a pattern. He realizes he is reading way too fast. He is skimming dense material just to get to the end of the chapter so he can check it off his list.
We've all been there.
Right. His actionable response to that insight isn't just to feel guilty. His response is to physically alter his behavior.
So what does he do?
He slows his pace. He starts forcing himself to outline the chapters. He makes a rule that he has to return to difficult, frustrating passages and fully comprehend them before allowing himself to move on to the next section.
He builds speed bumps into his own process.
Yes, exactly.
Or let's look at the interpersonal side. Say his reflection exposes that deep-seated intellectual pride we talked about earlier. The text suggests he might apply that painful insight by completely overhauling how he approaches conversations at work or with his friends.
Right.
Instead of entering a discussion waiting for his turn to speak so he can show off a new concept he just learned.
Which is very tempting.
Very tempting. But instead, he enters the conversation with a totally different posture. He asks himself what he still needs to learn from the person in front of him. It shifts him from being a lecturer to being a student in every interaction.
And it practically changes how he manages his calendar, too. The essay notes that if Gino reads about the relentless perseverance in Edward Gibbon's historical studies, he doesn't just sit around waiting for a sudden magical burst of inspiration to hit him before he decides to read.
Because inspiration is fleeting.
He recognizes that inspiration is totally unreliable. So he sets aside a regular, non-negotiable hour in his daily schedule specifically for reading and reflection. He treats that hour as a profound commitment. He builds the physical infrastructure required for discipline.
And if you are listening to this trying to figure out how to fit a rigorous self-education into a life that already feels stretched thin by responsibilities, I think this is the blueprint.
It really is.
You do not wait for the mythical free time to suddenly appear, because the modern world is designed to consume every second of your free time.
You will eat it right up.
You don't wait to feel inspired, because most days you will just feel tired. You have to carve out the hour. You carve it out of your morning sleep, or you carve it out of your evening television, and you guard it.
You make it a deliberate act of stewardship over your time, exactly as Gibbon did in 1761.
This reframes the entire definition of what learning actually is. It has nothing to do with being the smartest person in a meeting.
Yeah.
It is a continuous, lifelong conversation between your memory, your lived experience, your deeply held beliefs, and your daily reflection.
And if we connect this to the broader philosophy of the essay, Villalpando is arguing that education is a lifelong vocation.
A calling.
It is a calling, not a destination. It doesn't end when you are handed a diploma. Over the years, this grueling daily discipline of facing the blank page matures. It stops feeling like a daily chore, and it aggregates into a lifelong archive of a mind in constant evolution.
Yeah.
The essay uses a truly beautiful metaphor to describe the ultimate state of the journal. It says the notebook becomes both a mirror and a map.
A mirror and a map. Let's break that down.
Okay, so it is a mirror because on any given Tuesday, it reflects the immediate, unvarnished condition of his inner life. It shows him exactly who he is today, flaws and all. But over the span of decades, it becomes a map. It allows him to look backward and clearly trace the convoluted path by which raw, inert knowledge was slowly, painfully transformed into actual character.
Wow.
It proves that wisdom is never forged by grand, sweeping New Year's resolutions or sudden flashes of unearned brilliance. Wisdom is forged exclusively through small, difficult acts of honesty, repeated relentlessly over time.
The journal acts as the load-bearing bridge between his present reflections and his future purpose, and most importantly, it keeps him perennially teachable.
It keeps the education alive.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is frightening, honestly.
Yeah. The essay suggests that without this kind of rigorous recorded examination, our experiences just fade into a blur of forgetfulness.
They really do.
You can live for 20 years, but if you aren't actively examining that life and recording how it changes you, you might not have 20 years of wisdom. You might just be living the exact same unexamined year 20 times over.
And that is precisely why the discipline of the self-taught mind is not some lesser backup path to formal university schooling.
Right.
In many ways, as the source text strongly suggests, it is a vastly more demanding and dangerous pilgrimage. You have no safety net.
None.
You are your own teacher, setting the curriculum. You are your own witness, observing the changes. And you are your own examiner, grading your integrity.
It is an incredible, challenging arc to consider. We started with Edward Gibbon's call to embrace that second education, the crucial one you have to give yourself. Yeah. We looked at the gritty mechanics of how Gino actually executes it in the modern world. Not by speed reading to feed his ego, but by slowly, deliberately interrogating texts and layering his journaling to force a collision with his own character. We explored the brutal emotional hurdles, the dread of the blank page, the fitting room mirror that exposes our hypocrisy, the temptation to create a false persona in ink, and how treating our time as a strict stewardship is the only way to push through that paralysis. And finally, we see the profound reward of this process. A long-term moral growth where raw knowledge is actually metabolized into refined judgment and unshakable integrity. It emphasizes, above all else, that the true measure of an education is not the credential hanging on the wall.
Not at all.
It is the quiet willingness to think carefully, to record your own failures honestly, and to allow the knowledge you acquire to dictate how you actually live your life.
Which brings us to the ultimate challenge for you, the listener.
Yes. Based on everything we've unpacked from Gino's solitary journey, we want to challenge you to bypass the complex three-step process just for tonight and simply ask yourself Gino's final daily question.
Before you go to sleep tonight, open a notebook or even just a note on your phone and ask, what did today teach me?
Just force yourself to write down one honest, unvarnished answer. See what that tiny bit of friction uncovers about your own mind.
It is a very small act of stewardship. But as we've seen with Gibbon and Gino, it is the repetition of those small acts that eventually draws the map of your character.
But before we completely wrap up this deep dive, there is one final, somewhat provocative thought embedded in the source material that we need to leave you with. It is something for you to mull over as you stare at that blank page tonight. Early on in the essay, Villapano quotes Gibbon saying this: "Conversation enriches the understanding, but solitude is the school of genius."
Solitude is the school of genius. It speaks directly to the intensely private, isolated nature of this entire journaling endeavor.
Journaling is the ultimate tool of solitude. You are completely alone in that wilderness with your thoughts, your books, and your exposed flaws. But if this intensely private, solitary curriculum is what completely shapes and fortifies a person's inner life, what happens next?
Right.
Does the self-taught mind run the risk of becoming too comfortable in the wilderness? Does it become too isolated from the very noisy, messy community it ultimately wishes to serve? Or is that quiet, unflinching solitude, that harsh mirror of the blank page, the absolutely only possible way to forge true, unshakable convictions before you were ready to bring them out into the world?